Welcome everyone to the DeepMath conference today. It is a pleasure for us to have Caroline Uhler from MIT. She is currently the Henry and Grace Doherty Associate Professor in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and she's also affiliated with the Institute for Data Systems and Society, and she co-directs an institute, the Enric and Wendy Schmidt Center at the Broad Institute, and she has many accolades. I'm just going to mention a few. She's the recipient of a Simons Investigator Award, the Sloan Research Fellowship, an NSF Career Award, and she was chosen to be a Sofia Kowalewski Award by the Humboldt Foundation. Thank you so much for being with us today, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much for this invitation and for this kind introduction. So I hope you're seeing my slides, and let me do full screen.
Yes, perfect. So is this noise?
It's not in my, but I do also hear it. Okay, so let's get started. So I'll tell you a little bit about recent work that we've been doing at this intersection between generative modeling and causality, and in particular put this into a particular application, namely in the light of drug repurposing for COVID-19. So let me start exactly by just motivating what is actually needed for drug repurposing for COVID-19, and also more generally for drug repurposing, and then go from there to why we may want to look at autoencoders and why causality may be really important. So if we're thinking just generally about drug development, and in particular in the COVID-19 crisis that we're in, here, due to the urgency of this situation right now, it seems that, one of the most viable approaches is really just drug repurposing. So that means, you're looking at drugs that are already FDA approved, and you're trying to find drugs that are also effective in a new context, in this COVID-19 context. So in that sense, you don't have to go through some of the safety trials anymore. You can just directly go to trials where you're actually checking for the effectiveness in this new disease context. Now, how do most drugs work? So most drugs are inhibitors, so they bind to a protein so that it cannot perform its downstream role anymore. And so I want to talk a little bit about computational. So most drugs are still developed purely experimentally, but I want to just talk a little bit about computational ways that drugs have actually been developed and have also made it all the way through FDA approval, etc. So here I'm talking about two main approaches for computational approaches for drug development. So the first one is this, that takes into account, that drugs are mainly, what they do is that they bind to a protein so that it cannot perform its downstream role anymore. So for that kind of approach, what you often do is you try to look at networks, right? So for example, here, often you start with this protein-protein interaction network, so a network that is widely available and that you can just download, of which proteins interact with each other. And then a standard approach is to look at all of the nodes and kind of color nodes by, how differentially expressed they are in, as nodes could, for example, be genes or proteins. Then you look at how differentially expressed they are in the disease context as compared to the normal context. So in this way, you figure out where in the network is there anything that is disease associated, right? So maybe you figure out that in this part of the this subnetwork here, there are a whole lot of nodes that are disease associated, that are misregulated in the disease. And then a standard approach would be to now in this subnetwork, look for nodes that are very central to this subnetwork. And these might actually be very good targets for drugs, because then you're hoping that you're changing something in the subnetwork. Now, of course, this already tells you that while this protein-protein interaction network is an undirected graph, this approach actually really requires directed information, right? Although it is nowadays standardly done in this way, where you just find a node that is kind of central and you just have a drug that attacks this particular node. Well, if your directed network, and there is an underlying directed network, because in biology, these are regulatory relationships. If your network looks like this, where everything is pointing into this node that you are targeting with your drug, well, then nothing is going to change, right? You're targeting the sync node here. So obviously nothing is going to change about these disease-associated genes or proteins. And so this drug will be completely ineffective. Whereas, you know, if your network looks something like this, where you have a whole lot of edges going out of this targeted node into these disease-associated nodes, then at least there is a chance of it actually being effective in the disease context. Okay, so this is already the first way of seeing why causality actually matters, right? When you're looking at, when you're trying to identify drugs or targets for drug targeting, namely, you do need to know like these regulatory relationships, right? You're going to find nodes that kind of look like this, where you are pointing towards a whole lot of disease-associated nodes. So that's the first part where, you know, a computational approach where you definitely see that causality should be used. Then a second approach that is often used for drug discovery or drug repurposing on a computational side is to actually use these very large-scale drug screening data sets that have been collected and are in fact also publicly available, at least the one that I'm going to talk about. And let me actually show it to you on the next slide. So this is a very large scale, you see here over 1 million samples, drug screening data set. It's known as the CMAP or connectivity map data set. It's freely available at the Broad Institute, where you have a whole lot of different kinds of perturbations. So these are a lot of different small molecule perturbations, FDA-approved drugs, but also all kinds of genetic perturbations that have been applied to many different cell types and cell lines and disease contexts. Now, the thing is that this particular data set is mainly for cancer. So all of these different cell types that you have here, they're in fact cancer cell lines. Okay, so you have many, many different perturbations applied to all kinds of different cancer cell lines. Every entry in here is a 1,000 dimensional vector. So it's gene expression that has been measured. So humans have 20,000 genes. So instead of measuring all 20,000, they have like a well-selected, 1,000 genes that matter in many different diseases. And so only these 1,000 genes have been selected. But it's a very large data set, right, of like many different perturbations applied to many different cancer cell lines. And every time you're measuring this 1,000 dimensional vector. So it's really a tensor where all of these black entries here have been filled in. Now, of course, the question is, how can you use these kinds of data sets in a new disease context, right? We want to say something about COVID-19 and not about these particular cancer types that have been looked at here. And so what we need to do is try to, from these kinds of data sets, try to infer what is the effect of a drug in a new disease context, right? And once you can infer the effect of a drug in a new disease context, which we'll have to talk about how to do that, right? Then what these approaches actually do is the following. So then you want to order your drugs by how much they are able to go or push you back towards the normal state in your disease context. Okay, so how you should think of this is you have a signature of the disease, which corresponds to a vector in this 1,000 dimensional space of, you're in the normal state versus you're in disease state. So that's the vector corresponding to the disease signature, right? How does the disease look like in this 1,000 dimensional space? And now you have all of your drugs and the predicted effect of all of these drugs in this 1,000 dimensional space. And what you would like to find is a drug whose signature is as much anti-correlated with the disease signature as possible, right? So that it kind of pushes you back to the normal state. So that's this signature matching. This approach is known is another computational approach in order to try to find candidates for drug repurposing or for drug discovery. So these are two approaches that I want to look at. In particular, the signature matching is the first one that I'm going to talk about. I also want to connect here. So I already connected this approach to causality, right, with the directed graphs. Also, the signature matching approach is in fact a causal question. Because a drug is an intervention, right? It is not the same as conditioning, that's the cell type, but a drug is an intervention. It only has an effect on downstream nodes. So what we're trying to do here is by, considering or having observed the effect of a particular drug or intervention on one context, the cell type, what we'd like to do is predict the effect of this drug on a different cell type for different contexts. Okay, so this problem is known as causal transportability. So I have a perturbation or an intervention. I get to see it in one context. I want to now be able to predict the causal effect of this perturbation in a different context. Okay, So think of this and it becomes clear that it's a causal question because we're more maybe used to thinking of it not in terms of drugs, but maybe in terms of policies, right? If you have a policy that was observed in, say, LA, and now you want to be able to predict what would introducing this policy mean in, say, Boston, then this is this causal transportability question. I have an intervention in one city. I would like to predict what is the effect of this intervention in a different city. Same question here for these drugs. Okay, so these are interventions. So therefore, this is a causal question of transporting between different kinds of contexts. Okay, so both of these are causal questions that we actually want to look at. And next, I want to talk about how does actually generative modeling come in, or at least for us, how has generative modeling come in here? Okay, so what we want to do here is, as I said, we want to kind of fill in some of these holes, right? But in particular, we want to fill in these holes for a column where we have not observed anything, right? For a column corresponding to SARS-CoV-2 infected lung epithelial cells, we would like to be able to fill in what is the effect of all these drugs on this particular context where we have not observed any of these drugs before. One thing that maybe I should say, I mean, many of you will think directly about matrix completion problems, and these are usually low rank completion problems. So low rank doesn't work, right? When you have not observed any entries in a column, then low rank doesn't work because you're just going to fill in a constant. So those approaches will not work in this context. Okay, so we need something a bit different. Okay, so let's see, another very standard approach, probably if you're coming from an ML perspective, is maybe something like a style transfer approach. So we all know about style transfer, often used using GANs. I'm going to use it using autoencoders, just because we have a pretty good understanding theoretically of autoencoders. And I'll show you also some of these, some of what we know about the functions that are learned using autoencoders. Okay, so if we want to do style transfer using autoencoders, so what has been observed, of course, to work well is these like translations in the latent space. So say you have a whole lot of images of people, right? Some people like to smile, others don't. So then you have some people where you just train an autoencoder where you actually get to see them in a neutral face and in a smiley face. Other people, they just never smile, so you'll only get to see them in a neutral face. And so now what you can do, and what has worked quite well, and maybe surprisingly well, is that you can take this vector here, which corresponds to adding a smile. You move this vector up to this new person that you've also encoded here. Here comes out the dot, right? And now you can, through the decoder, you can map it back to image space, and out comes a person that is actually smiling. And I'm sure you've seen these things of like Yosemite images of Yosemite in the winter, Yosemite in the summer, where you just like add the transformation or the style corresponding to summer. So we can think of doing something similar for drugs, right? So say you have observed the effect of a drug on one cell type. And now what you would like to know is you would like to predict what is the effect of this drug on a different cell type, right? So then maybe a drug could be seen as a style. So let us encode all of the data that we have and just predict, so first of all, you observe what is the effect of this drug on one cell type, and then you just move over this effect of a drug to your new cell type and just predict that that's what this drug will do on this new cell type. Just predicted from the latent space. Okay, so now it's interesting. So this has, of course, and also pharma industry has tried these approaches, and it has also been shown in some papers that, at least for a couple of drugs, this actually seemed to work quite well. And this was quite interesting in this paper here. Now, it might work on a couple of drugs as was shown here. What we try to do, and since one has such a huge data set, right, all of these entries here are actually given entries, so you can just check whether it works, right? I can just train it on a subset of these drugs, and then just try to translate it over to any of these other ones, any of these other cell types that are observed, and just see how well are these vectors aligned, right? So the effect of a drug in the latent space has to be aligned with the effect of the same drug in a different cell type, because otherwise it doesn't work, right? You cannot just transfer it over. And so it actually doesn't work well on this particular data set here. And I'll show you also some results of that it actually doesn't work. So these standard autoencoders do not work in general for this problem. And in fact, it has been observed by pharma industry as well. So AstraZeneca, for example, I know has looked at this and has seen that this in fact doesn't really work. Okay, so and so the question is, is there a way to get this to work, and what might be other architectures maybe that might actually get something like this to work out? Okay, and of course, what I write down here is that you should also not expect it in general to work, because there is work on causal transportability, right? That actually has necessary and sufficient conditions for when you can transport causal effects across different contexts. And so, just generally assuming that this will work is not the right thing to do, because there are theoretical results on this. Okay, but this is the problem that I want to look at, and I want to look at maybe other autoencoder structures where this problem could actually work. Okay, so again, we want to fill in some of these columns where everything is missing. Okay, so let me show you some results and then actually give the intuition for the kinds of autoencoders that we have used. Okay, and the results, as I said, will be just on the data set that we have, right? So here there is a whole lot of observations that are taken in all these different cell types. So we can just test how well do different kinds of autoencoders actually perform on this task. When are the effects of a drug aligned in the latent space, right? And hopefully they should be more, for it to say that it's working, it has to be more aligned in the latent space than in the original 1000 dimensional space. Okay, so these are your standard autoencoders, right? These here, they usually have a bottleneck. What I'm going to talk about in this talk, and what we've done quite a lot of work on also on the theoretical side, and these are the results that I'm going to show you, are on very unintuitive, maybe at first, autoencoders that we are now currently always using, in fact, are these over-parameterized autoencoders. So we're not going to use autoencoders for dimension reduction. We're actually going to have a latent space here that is even higher dimensional than what you started off with. Now, this is not how autoencoders were introduced, and they might sound completely crazy because, obviously now here I have enough parameters to actually just learn the identity map, right? So I should at least first of all convince you that, these autoencoders, they're not learning the identity map, and I have to show you that they're actually learning something interesting. And that's what I want to do in this example here, and then actually go also into the theory of what kinds of functions are these autoencoders learning. Okay, so what I'm going to show you here on this site is just the alignment of the effect of drugs across different cell types. I'm here choosing the two cell, so we've also done this for all cell types, so for all of the data on the previous slide. Here I'm just showing it for these two cell types that have the most data. Okay, so I'm choosing these two cell types and just looking at the effect of a drug in one versus the other. How aligned are the drug vectors in the latent space? Okay, so what do you see here? So this is the original space, the alignment in the original 1000 dimensional space if you don't do any embedding. And here is the alignment in the standard autoencoder when you go to a lower dimensional latent space. So you see here, this is 100 dimensional latent space. You can actually switch this up. It really doesn't matter. You'll actually see usually basically the same curve. And you see here that actually basically everything falls along the diagonal. So that means there was no effect of, like, whether you do it in the original space or not doesn't matter, but there is a little bit of an enrichment up here. Okay, so these are the drugs where you will do better when you're actually using your lower dimensional, your standard autoencoder as compared to just doing this in the original space. And it's well known that in the original space, it doesn't work. Like, drugs can have very different effects on different cell types. Okay, now here comes maybe something interesting. So here, this is our over-parameterized autoencoder. You see that we started in 1900 dimensional space, and we are going to an embedding of here 1000 dimensional space, over 1000 dimensional space. So this is this over-parameterized autoencoder. First of all, you see it doesn't learn the identity map, because if it was learning the identity map, I would get here a diagonal. Okay, so that's the first finding up here, that you should now believe me that these over-parameterized autoencoders might actually learn something interesting. They're definitely not learning the identity map. Okay, and second, they're actually, and we can also prove this. So in the end, what this will, if you do go more and more over-parameterized, what this will actually end up with is a step function. But generally already here, with just a little bit of over-parameterization, you see that we already have an enrichment of actually these drug vectors being aligned, right? And quite a strong enrichment of these drug vectors being aligned. Now, what is interesting is that you can actually get a similar plot if you just do PCA with only two principal components. Okay, so then you can tell me, like, well, here's similar alignment, right? So then you can tell me like, well, then why would I need an overparameterized autoencoder if I can do the same with two principal components? Well, the problem is that with two principal components, you're getting alignment, but you're getting alignment by basically throwing away all of the data, all of the information in the data, right? So if you're looking at, how well you can reconstruct the data is like extremely poorly. So yes, you can get alignment, and I can get very well alignment by just basically throwing out all of the information in the data. Now, the interesting thing is that, of course, if you're over-parameterized, I'm not throwing away any information in the data, right? I have, in fact, zero training error in this case, and I get alignment also on test examples. So, you get complete reconstruction, so no throwing away anything, any information. And in addition, I actually have, this kind of property that I want to have, which is this alignment property. Of course, in your standard autoencoder, you are getting rid of some of the information, right? Because you're not getting the zero training error in this case. Okay, so that's the advantage as compared to PCA, right? You don't want to reach alignment just by throwing out basically all the information you have in the data. Okay, so what I want to do next is to go through some of the theory of like, how did we even come up with these overparameterized autoencoders, and, and just show you what are the functions that are learned. Hopefully this shows that definitely it's not the identity map, and it might be actually something interesting happening. And then I'll get back to this application and finish the story right from here. Of course, now we do have the signatures of drugs in the latent space, and then we can look at which drugs are the most anti-correlated with COVID-19, and then look at which drugs come out. So I'll do that at the end. Okay, so let's look at these overparameterized autoencoders. So I want to do just a little bit of math here. So let me just look at this particular setting here. You have n samples, say they live in RK, and I'll do this, I'll look at this particular setting where the number of samples is smaller than the number of variables, RK. In general, what I mean by overparameterization is just that you can get to zero training error. Okay, so that will be my definition of overparameterization. Let me go through it here in this setting. What the autoencoder is trying to optimize is just this function, right? So this autoencoder function of what comes out minus what goes in. So this is the reconstruction error. And we're trying to optimize this neural network psi here so as to minimize the reconstruction error. Okay, so let me do something very simple just to get a little bit of intuition for what are the functions that are actually being learned by an autoencoder. Okay, so let me look at a very simple setting where psi is just a linear function, and say I have only one sample, so n is 1. Okay, so then what I'm trying to minimize is a times x minus x, right? And square whatever you want to take. Okay, so this is the function that I'm trying to minimize. Well, so, and a is, in rk times k, right? X, so this is in rk times k, and x is in rk times 1, right? Like what is written above. Okay, so, well, definitely we can minimize, so if you're minimizing this over a, right? Definitely you can get this to 0, right? You have many more parameters than you have equations. So for sure you can get this to 0, but also note that there are many different solutions in order to get this to 0, right? So either A could be the identity map, right? Then you just get x minus x, that's 0. But A could also be many other matrices. In particular, it could, for example, be a rank 1 matrix. And Soledad, sorry, I see you appearing. Is it, am I?
So yeah, we have two questions. One question is, what is the difference between an overparameterized autoencoder and a feed-forward network?
Okay.
And the other question is, do you use some form of penalty to promote the alignment?
Okay, those are perfect questions. So by overparameterized autoencoder, really all I'm doing is it is just an autoencoder, and it's just an autoencoder that you can train to 0 loss. That's my definition of an overparameterized autoencoder. Here is an example of an overparameterized autoencoder. As you see here in the linear setting, I can get 0 training error out. And then the other question about adding a regularizer, that's exactly the interesting thing. What we're going to show is that actually overparameterizing is just self-regularizing. So you can get the same effect as what I'm going to show what overparameterized autoencoders actually do And for example, Benjo has done that actually by adding a regularizer. So we'll show that they're contractive at the training examples. So he has done work and his group has done work like very early on and actually trying to find regularizers that do that. What we're showing here is you don't need regularizers, you just do over-parameterization and you're actually getting the same out. So no regularizers needed. Yep. Great, thank you so much. Yeah, okay, so so let me get back to this setting here in the linear setting, right? So here you can have, you have many different solutions. In particular, the identity matrix would be one solution. Any rank, sorry, not any, but like, for example, the rank 1 projection would be another solution, right? And you also have solutions of rank 2, of rank 3, etc. So there are many different solutions for this optimization problem. And now I'm sure that many of you have seen this proof. This is a pretty simple proof that if you're actually doing gradient descent initialized close to 0, then in fact, the solution that is learned in this linear setting is the rank 1 solution. Okay, so there are many different solutions. The question is, what does a neural network learn? Well, if it's this linear setting and you're doing gradient descent and you're initializing it close to 0, then actually the solution that comes out is the rank 1 solution. So now the question is, of course, well, generally, right, what happens in an autoencoder when you're training a nonlinear, your standard, you know, say UNet autoencoder on an overparameterized setting, right? What is the solution that is then learned? And just to get a little bit of intuition, let me show you what actually happens when you're training a UNet autoencoder on one sample. Okay, so we're just training it on these cute little bunnies here. And then what we're doing is you just, you know, you train it and now I can put in any image, right? And if I want to figure out what is the solution that is learned, well, let me look at what it's mapping it to. And so here what you see is actually something quite interesting is happening. It's that, you know, anything you put in, even if it's just noise, it's going to be mapped to the same little bunnies. So that means that in this case, the point map was learned, right? So anything you put in fact, just your bunnies come out. So this is an extreme form. It's not a rank 1 solution, right? Because rank 1 would have a linear combination of the bunnies. So it could also give out the negative of the bunnies. But here, in fact, the bunnies come out. So this is a point map onto the bunnies. And so this is really an extreme solution. Now, some people always tell me like, well, this is like to be expected. I do want to show you that, I mean, I don't think this should be expected. And let me show you why this should maybe not be expected. So first of all, as I showed you before, there are many solutions to this problem. The question is, which one does the autoencoder learn? And let me show you other examples where, you know, the same doesn't come out. So there is definitely something interesting happening. So let me do the following. So this UNet autoencoder is quite deep. Right, so let me take a very, very shallow autoencoder. And again, I'm just training it on one image. And then again, I'm just feeding in other examples. And as you see now, you know, well, something comes out that looks very similar to what I fed in. Okay, so now it didn't learn the point map. And in fact, so it's kind of interesting, right? People would say to me that it is to be expected that it learns the point map. There are other papers that say, well, autoencoders actually learn the identity map or can learn the identity map if they're like highly parameterized. So, well, okay, so this looks kind of like the identity map, right? In this setting, I will prove to you that this is also not the identity map. Okay, so these statements are also wrong when people say that, you know, these autoencoders learn the identity map. So I'll show this to you on the next slides, but definitely, you know, something interesting is happening when you're very deep. It can learn something like a point map. When you're very shallow and over parameterized, it actually seems to learn something that's very different. It learns something that is similar to an identity map, although it is not the identity map. And to show you in the linear setting what happens, here it's actually what you expect it to happen. And this is very easy to prove. If you have, you know, and here I'm showing it for two examples so that you very cleanly see that it's actually a linear combination of examples that comes out. So if you train it on like these two little examples here, you see that what you're actually learning is linear combinations of them. So you don't learn the point map like with non-linearities. For that, you really need non-linearities. Here, you're actually learning linear combinations of your training images. Okay, so let's try to understand what is actually happening in the non-linear settings. And this is actually a good example to study that. So what I'm going to do next, and it's very, very simple. It's just to understand what is the function that is learned, right? So you can train your autoencoder on some images, and then you put in a test image like what we're doing here, put in a test image, you look at what comes out. like with this horses, you look at what comes out. But now what I can do with an autoencoder, right, because it's a function from RK to RK, well, I can just put whatever comes out, I can put it back in through the autoencoder and just iterate the map. And I'll just look at what comes out in the end. And what if this was the identity map, then if I would iterate, I should always remain in these horses, right? And here I should always remain in the flower if it was the identity map. If it's not the identity map, then I might diverge to something else. And that's in fact what is happening. So let me show you how this works. So here we trained it on 500 images. These are in fact some of the training images that we had. And we did exactly that. So you put in some test image. Here what I'm showing you are test images where we just put a whole lot of noise on top of a training image. So that's a test image. Then you feed it through your autoencoder. And this is already after some iterations. So after one iteration or so, you get something that looks very similar to what you fed it. But then if you continue iterating it, what is really quite interesting is actually that you're converging to something, first of all, and that you're converging to one of your training images. Okay, so it's not learning the identity map, but it is learning quite an interesting map, namely a map where the training examples are attractors. And I'll prove something like this, but this is this is the function class that is learned by these overparameterized autoencoders. It's not the identity map, but it's actually learning a function where the training examples are attractors. And as was asked before, are we using regularizers? We're not using any regularizers, but there have been others before who have in fact used regularizers that do exactly this, right? To make the maps that are learned by autoencoders be attractive at the training examples. But what we're showing here, and so that's good for us because others have thought that this is a good, right? That this is a good property of autoencoders, so we don't have to think about that as much, right? But yeah, so what is happening directly with overparameterization is actually that these autoencoders are self-regularizing and they're learning maps that are contractive at the training examples. So that's all that is shown here. And here, if you want to do something in 2D, you see exactly these regions of attraction and how they look like. It's an interesting open question. I'll also have it at the end, right? We should understand much better what are these regions of attraction? How is the space broken up? It seems to depend on the nonlinearity you're using. The space will be broken up differently. And of course, something that we should really be studying if we want to find the right autoencoders for the right applications. Okay. So how many training examples can you make as attractors? Here we can show examples where we have 500 ImageNet examples as attractors. We now have a proof that if you're overparameterized enough, you can make any number of attractors. We didn't have it at the time when this paper came out. And this is the theorem here that says, and again, this is now for one training examples. We do have the proof in general as well. But here in this PNAS paper, what we have is that if you have any one training example, then with suitable depth and width of the autoencoder, you will make this training example be an attractor. And how this proof worked is really just actually figuring out a closed form formula for any nonlinearity and width and depth that tells you what the eigenvalue is of the Jacobian at the training example. And so you just need to figure out that you can make this eigenvalue in absolute value be smaller than 1, meaning that this point will be an attractor. And what we proved is that you can always make this smaller than 1 if you have enough depth or enough width. Okay, so that's how this proof works. And so that at least shows these results here, right? That proves these kinds of results that with one training example, you will, if you at least whatever it is, with even if you have small width, right? If you're iterating your map, then you're actually going to converge to your training example. And it doesn't really prove anything about this setting yet, where we have 500 training examples. But as I said, now we do have the general proof as well. Okay, so now there are always like some questions that we're getting here. Is one question is about generalization, and the other question is about memorization versus memorization in general versus generalization. Okay, so so first of all, okay, so why might this be a good thing for autoencoders to learn? So we did look at generalization now for other applications, but first of all, we need to figure out what it means to generalize for an autoencoder, right? So, sometimes people would use the term generalization in autoencoders as that it's learning a function that is like the identity map. Well, I mean, I wouldn't define that as generalization, because if you want to learn the identity map, I don't have to train an autoencoder, right? That's all you want, then don't train an autoencoder, and I have the perfectly generalizing function. So that's definitely not the right definition of generalization. I need something better than that. So of course, if you have a particular application in mind, then you can maybe define generalization as compared to that application. That makes total sense. And you know, that's how we've been looking at generalization. It seems like these autoencoders generalize quite well for particular applications that we've looked at. Now, more generally, I think it is an important problem to ask, how do we define generalization for autoencoders? And you know, one definition could be that it should be contractive at your training examples, so that, you know, anything that is close to a training example will actually be mapped to something that is closer to a training example. That probably makes sense, and that it is otherwise close to the identity map, right? It shouldn't just be the identity map, but maybe a definition is that, you know, as long as it's close to identity map and attractive at the training examples, that might be a good definition. That's something that we're proposing here. But I think there should be a whole lot of discussion on how should we define generalization for autoencoders. And so if that is the definition that we want to go by, and you know, I'm sure there are many other proposals as well, and it should be discussed. But if we go by this definition, then what it would suggest, and I'll show you on the next slide, is that we should actually go very, very wide in terms of autoencoders and not deep. Okay, so wide, and I'll show this afterwards, but you know, these deep autoencoders, right, what they do, what we've seen here is they seem to be learning more something like a step function, so super contractive at the training examples. So that means you're far away from the identity map, right? So if you're super contractive at the training examples, that's what happens with depth. Then you're far away from the identity map. But what you want is to make a lot of training examples be attractors. For that, you need a lot of width, and then just enough depth so that all of your training examples are in fact attractive. Okay, so that's what that would suggest if we're actually going with a definition like that. Then maybe one more point about interpolation versus memorization. So also these two terms are often used interchangeably. So I mean, here in some sense, so we have been trying to be kind of careful in this. So interpolation just means that you get training, in this case, like training error 0, right? That you're interpolating your training examples. So you're learning a function that goes through your training examples. Now, to us, that doesn't mean memorization, because in some sense, if this is a function that interpolates, right, from R1 to R1, this is a function that goes through your training examples. But to me, this is not a function that memorizes the training examples, because you cannot, if I give you this map, this function, you cannot tell me what the training examples are, right? There is no way for you to say that this is a training example or this. It could also be this dot here. There's no way for you to tell that this is actually where your training examples are. So it's definitely an interpolating solution, but not, in my sense, not a memorizing one. Whereas if I give you a map like this, then obviously you can tell me where the training examples are, right? Because anything on these lines here is a training example. And also, if I give you a contractive map like this, you can actually recover the training examples, right? Because, you know, if you just iterate it, you can actually recover the training examples. And that's why we feel whatever these over-parameterized autoencoders, they are in fact memorizing the training examples, because you can recover the training examples from the map that is learned. From an interpolating one, you cannot, in general, recover the training examples. Okay, so that's just a little bit of language that I think we should be a bit careful when we're doing theory in deep learning, that we're actually not just using different terms in all kinds of different ways. Okay, so in terms of like what does width do versus depth, so again, here there should be a lot more proofs. I'm just suggesting things that I think hold, based on simulations and based on some initial proofs that we have, but definitely not a complete picture yet. So what seems to be happening, and I was alluding to it before, is when you go very wide, then what is happening to your eigenvalues around your training examples, it seems that the distribution is becoming smaller and smaller. So it's becoming more concentrated. So the distribution of eigenvalues is becoming more concentrated. Whereas when you're increasing width, depth, what is happening is that your eigenvalues are shifting, okay? So it's becoming more and more attractive, right? So your eigenvalues are all shifting down. So if you define generalization as how I'm suggesting it, but again, I'm not, we definitely have to have discussion about it. So if you want it to be like close to the identity map, but contractive at the training examples, then what you would need to do is go very wide so that all of your training examples, or at least so that it's interpolating at all of your training examples, and then go just deep enough so that all of your max eigenvalues are smaller than 1, but you don't want to make them be close to 0 so that it becomes just a step function. Okay, so very wide and just enough depth so that you actually make your training examples be attractors, or the kinds of neural networks that we're currently using. They really come out of this theory of like how we have been doing here the analysis. Okay. So with that, I want to have enough time for questions. So that's how far we are in terms of understanding the functions that are learned by these overparameterized autoencoders. That was our intuition for actually trying to use them in the first place in this particular application. Now, maybe there is still kind of a jump in terms of why did we use, just because they're contractive at training examples, why did we think that they would also be aligning the effect of drugs in the latent space? And I agree there is a jump there. So the first idea, and it seems like theoretically it's actually not quite right, but at least I'll tell you how we were motivated by it. We thought that if things are attractive at training examples, then maybe it's not just attractive at 0-dimensional points, but maybe it's also attractive at lower dimensional manifolds. So say along lines or along some lower dimensional manifolds, even two-dimensional manifolds, etc. So we thought that maybe it is also attractive along other lower dimensional spaces. And so that's what we've been doing. That's what was at least the initial motivation for actually looking at them and seeing that this actually works quite well. There seems to be a bit more going on theoretically, other than being aligned along lower dimensional manifolds. And so that's something that we're definitely working on. But that was the right intuition for these kinds of applications here for drugs, and that it actually works. But there seems to be something about the data distribution that actually makes it work in this particular application. Okay, so that's as far as we are in terms of understanding autoencoders from a theoretical perspective, and also the kinds of autoencoders that we're currently always using in any of these applications, and how this actually works for drugs. And so I just want to end this talk by showing you what are actually the drugs that come out when you're doing this analysis. So from these overparameterized autoencoders, we're getting the signature of drugs, right? And now we just do this, just look at which drugs are anti-correlated with the disease signature, which is exactly what I described at the beginning. And you just rank your drugs based on that. Okay, so you just rank your drugs based on which ones are most anti-correlated with your disease signature. Outcomes are some selection of drugs. Here are the drugs that we have found in this analysis. It's quite interesting that you get a nice list of drugs that is not just all over the place, but they're clustered into 2 main categories of drugs. That's quite nice, right? That you don't get just some random selection out. But what does come out is that a lot of these are cancer drugs with a whole lot of targets. So as you see here, so many of them actually have a whole lot of targets. And so the question is, these cancer drugs do have a lot of side effects. So the question is, could we maybe identify which ones of all of these targets is actually the causal one? And then maybe one can actually come up with drugs that would be more targeted to that particular target that we think is the causal one, instead of taking a cancer drug that has a whole lot of targets. So maybe we can then find actually drugs that are more specific. And so that's exactly what we did with a causal analysis, as I said at the beginning, right, where we're actually trying to learn the underlying directed network instead of having such an undirected graph here. We've done a lot of research in recent years of coming up with algorithms that can actually do this. So from observational and interventional data can actually learn these causal directed graphs. And so using this, all we wanted to do is rank these targets. Okay, so you have here a list of targets. We want to find which one of these targets is the one that is most upstream to all of the differentially expressed genes, differentially expressed in the disease. So which one is most upstream to all of the disease-associated genes? That's all. We're just ranking all of these targets in that way. And in fact, even if you look at 2 different cell types that are closely related, just to look for robustness, you often have to do that in these studies. You actually always find the same target that is most upstream. It's this RIPK1. What is quite interesting is that this RIPK1, okay, so we know SARS-CoV-2 has something to do with aging. If you don't take aging signature into account, you're actually not finding RIPK1. And finally, what is quite interesting is that RIPK1 at the same time, actually, when we were writing this paper, was quite nice that this paper came out that showed that RIPK1 directly can bind to SARS-CoV-2 proteins, suggesting that there might actually be a role of this protein. We also have a suggested mechanism of this protein. You know, the RIPK1 is, I didn't know anything about it before, but it's really quite interesting. It has two domains. You can turn on one or the other. If you turn on one, you actually get, it activates the immune response and all of the survival pathways. If you activate the other, it actually turns on all of the death pathways, and in fact has like consequences that we do see in COVID-19, like fibrosis and blood clotting, when it actually goes wrong, right? When it goes really badly. So it could be that the same protein is actually effective in young individuals as in old individuals, where, you know, in one sense, it might be actually turning on the right pathways. In the other one, when it actually turns on like very, you know, pathways that we actually don't want to be turning on. So it could be that this RIPK1 is actually involved in both of these different kinds of downstream pathways that are then turned on. But of course, there is a whole lot of analysis that now needs to be done. And what is really exciting for us is that this RIPK1 actually just entered phase 2. An inhibitor specific for RIPK1 just entered phase 2 clinical trial. So that's quite exciting. Okay, so with that, let me end and just say that, you know, I talked about one particular transport problem in biology, which is about transporting the effect of interventions across different cell types. So basically this one here, where you have a whole lot of different kinds of interventions that you're, say, you know, observing in one cell type, or, you know, in the most extreme case in a mouse, say, and what you would like to do is transport the effect of these perturbations to humans, or what we did is something not as extreme, right? Going from some cancer cell lines and transporting that to a SARS-CoV-2 infected lung epithelial cell. Now, there are all kinds of other problems in terms of transporting and generative models and causality that we've been working on and are really excited about coming from the biology motivation. One that I think is a very hard one and that needs to be a whole lot more research is on transporting between different perturbations. So, you know, you can see this in the genetic setting, or for drugs. Say you have observed some drugs on a particular cell type. Can you now predict the effect of new drugs on the cell type? Or you have observed genetic perturbations on one cell type. Can you now from that predict the effect of other perturbations, other genetic perturbations on that cell type? So that's transporting between different perturbations. Here it's transporting perturbations between different cell types. You may also want to transport between different data modalities, say imaging and expression. You may want to transport between different time points. In particular, moving, you know, earlier in time is like very important in the biological literature. So a whole lot of, you know, questions that are generative of nature, but also causal, because you often do have access to very large scale perturbations. I think is something that's really exciting that comes from the biological literature. And if you're interested in causality, then of course, those are some of the data sets that you may want to use in order to show that your algorithms actually work quite well. Okay, so with that, let me end. I have summary slide, what we've done. Hopefully I was able to convince you of a theoretical and algorithmic framework for, you know, moving between different perturbations. These overparameterized autoencoders show remarkable self-regularization properties and might have interesting mechanisms for associative memory. A lot of open problems, I already discussed some of them. We really need to understand how these regions of attraction look like, how this relates to questions about classification, et cetera, et cetera. And so with that, let me end. And thank, of course, an amazing group without whom it wouldn't be possible to do all this work. Then collaborators on the work I presented, Misha Belkin on the overparameterized autoencoders, and Shiva's lab on everything that I showed that has biology and imaging and the virus, etc. And with that, let me thank you guys also for the questions you've already asked, and I hope I can answer some more questions as well.
Thank you so much. This was an amazing talk. Thanks, Caroline. I have a question about something that I didn't understand. So when you look at the attractors, which of your training data points do you want to be attractors? Like, do you choose that, or is that?
No, Yes, so this is a great question. So now we do have the proof that you can make it, so if you're over-parameterized, if you make it over-parameterized enough, all of your training examples will become attractive. All of them will. So now I think how I could turn your question into is like what you would like for particular applications is that some points have larger regions of attraction as compared to others. And so I think this is exactly what we need to understand. So yes, all of them will become attractors, but what are good nonlinearities to choose so that somehow this picture actually looks good, looks how we would want it to look, right? And so what is the metric that is being learned basically in this space? And maybe more generally, and this also is something that, one may, if one understands this, then maybe you could also introduce some training examples where you would say like everything that is garbage should be somehow, be mapped to that point. So can you come up with a point that will have a huge region of attraction where somehow everything that is somehow not close to any of your training examples will just be mapped there? I think that would be really interesting. I don't think we know how to do that. We first have to understand this space here.
So you're saying that you want to find a way to design the basin of attraction for like chosen training points, like through the design of the network.
Yeah, or maybe it's not the design. So I feel, what will come out here. I mean, you see it here. So somehow I think we do have an intuition for what kinds of metrics are being learned. It will be something like nearest neighbor, right? But maybe changed a little bit by your nonlinearity. So I don't think, so maybe you can choose this a little bit, but probably not too much. You can change it a little bit by the nonlinearities. I think how you'll be able to change it is by choosing a good training point. That is not, in your real training examples, you make a particular training point so that a lot of stuff will be mapped there. And hopefully all of the stuff that is kind of garbage will be mapped there. That's maybe where you have more choices of choosing something. Then, in like how you're choosing your nonlinearity or other parameters in your network. But it's a good question. I don't know. This is just, the intuition I would have.
Maybe a small comment is that this coming from somebody who plays with nonlinear dynamics is that Bayesian boundaries in n-dimensional space are codimension 1 surfaces, and God, I'm afraid of anything of dimension of like bigger than 2 or 3 or 4 is beyond. So it's I mean, I understand the ambition, but it's very difficult to think about parametrizing basins of attraction boundary.
Yes, I completely agree. And also I want to actually highlight exactly what you're saying. A picture in 2D might be completely wrong. Okay, so any of our intuition that we're getting, because we're talking about over-parameterized spaces. So really we're going to go into a very, very high dimensional space. And so then even more, whatever I'm drawing here might be completely off in terms of the intuition of what is really happening in this higher dimensional space. And I agree, it's a really hard question, but I think we need to get to it, right? We need to try to understand what are actually these metrics that are being learned. Even if it's not exactly the boundaries, but saying at least,
I think you need big balls within the boundaries.
Exactly. Exactly. Something like that would be good. Like even showing things like that they have to be connected is a small, should not be so hard to show. So even like very simple questions about this space might actually already be interesting.
Maybe another quick one. Have you thought of using as a measure of a success of either an autoencoder or anything that's mapping something to something else, whether they are diffeomorphic, whether there exists a nice invertible transformation? Like, for example, if you have very jiggly autoencoders, they are not one-to-one. If you remember,
right.
I mean, so why is that a good one? I'm interested. Like, look, you see the ones that you have, the middle and the right, they are one-to-one. The one on the left is good, but it's not one-to-one. And one-to-oneness in my mind is a big thing.
Yeah.
What's your thought about it?
No, I agree. I think that could actually be a good thing to look at. So this one is not one that is being learned, right? So we haven't really thought about it, but I think there is a lot of questions of what are good maps. In particular here, where it's, as you're saying, it's like going from one space to another space. It's not the classification setting, so we have to first define what it means to generalize. And there could be many different definitions. And I agree, we should actually think through it carefully, right? What does it mean to actually generalize? And it has to be it has to be a property of these functions that are learned. Yeah, thank you, great question.
We have another question in the chat by Yain Cooper. She asks, out of curiosity, of all the drugs that appeared in the analysis based on your technique, what is the best predicted drug?
Oh, okay, so this is great. So this is this RIPK1. So it was very consistent that it was always RIPK1 as a target coming out. So you can look at all of the ones that have here RIPK1 in it. So this would be the drugs that actually attach, that these are cancer drugs that are targeting this RIPK1. But that's why, because these drugs, as you see here, appear many times above as well for other targets. So these are drugs that target a lot of different proteins in a cell. We looked at which drugs would actually be more specific. So this RIPK1 inhibitor that is currently in trials was not in the data set. So that's why it was kind of interesting to actually figure out which ones of these targets are the ones that where we would like to find drugs. But if I would have to choose a drug that is in this data set, then these are the three. Yeah. But really the final finding is this RIPK1 target, and there are RIPK1 inhibitors that are currently in trials.
Thanks. So do we have other questions? I don't see other questions in the chat, the Q&A. Okay. So thank you so much, Caroline, for your talk. And
Thank you very much.
We're gonna, if you agree, we're gonna post it on YouTube.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm gonna wait one more minute and I'm gonna introduce Yannis. Mm-hmm. Okay, so welcome again. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. It is my pleasure to introduce Yannis Kevrekidis. He is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor in Chemical and Biomedical Engineering at Johns Hopkins. He's also has a secondary appointment with Applied Math. He is a very distinguished professor. He has been a professor at Princeton from 1986 to 2017, and he has won many awards, including last year he was elected at the National Academy of Engineering, and I cannot name all the awards. He's a Guggenheim Fellow.
He used to be young and promising. Thank you.
Well, we are so happy to have you to give a talk here, and yeah, we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So, in addition to all the other things that Soledad said, I'm one of these people who played with neural networks for dynamical systems in the 90s when it was not particularly fashionable, and then we kind of let it go because it was not particularly fashionable. So on the one hand, we are very happy to see what happens today. On the other hand, we're a bit jealous. Anyway, so what I'm going to talk to you about, what I really want to talk to you about, is learning emergent PDEs in emergent spaces, and I'll explain what that means. But I'm going to make you suffer through some of the old stuff for a few minutes at the beginning, just for fun, or just as a, me having memories from an old time. So my example of why I was interested in many of these problems, I'm interested in using machine learning and data mining to learn and solve and design dynamical systems. In particular, I'm interested in nonlinear dynamics. That's why I said that I was interested in Bayesian of attraction boundaries before. And this is my little example of what we call equation-free stuff, which started around 2000. This is a complicated problem, and these are two different ways of viewing it. On the left, you have plankton microorganisms. So this is a big coupled stochastic set of differential equations. These guys, if I play them for you, they are kind of giving birth, they die, they're swished around by the ocean. But if you look on the right, and I post it now, you see the right macroscopic thing of interest, which happens to be the pair correlation function, which is how many neighbors they have on average as a function of the neighborhood. And while on the right things are horrific, on the left things are horrific as they go on. On the right, you see that you have a very nice like partial differential equation going to a steady state. So it becomes important, if you are not so bright mathematically, how can you, through machine learning, discover first what are the right variables to look at macroscopically, and the second is what are the right evolution equations from these variables from the data. And when we did this, we developed this idea of equation-free. This is with Bill Gear, who many of you may know because of Gear's method in integrating ODEs. So equation-free is, how do I solve macroscopic equations for the pair correlation function if I don't know what the formulas are, and the only thing that I have in my pocket is the microscopic simulator. So think for a moment, this is something called coarse projective integration. It's a multi-scale computing method. You run for a short time the particle code that you have. You observe the dynamics at the macro level in terms of the evolution of the pair correlation function, estimate the pair correlation function, and then make a big jump in the pair correlation function. So the idea is that the interactions of the particles are very fast, but the evolution of the macroscopic statistics is relatively slow. When you have the new pair correlation function, you create particles that have this pair correlation function. This should remind you of guns. And then you run them for a short time and then make another jump. So the basic idea in all of this is that you have equations at the micro level. You believe that equations at the macro level exist. You just don't know what they are. And the question is how to solve these equations with the smallest amount of microscopic running. Make small bursts of microscopic simulations, observe them, and use these observations on the fly to do macroscopic computing with the macroscopic equations that you don't have written down. To do this, you must know first what are the right observables to observe. So that's a big thing. In this problem that I told you, somebody had told me that the right macro observable is the pair correlation function. How do we find good variables? So this is the variable free part. Either you know a lot of mathematics in the right moments, or there is somebody who is either experienced or brilliant, and figures out what the right observables are at the macro level, or you use, let's say, diffusion maps, which is what we happen to use, or isomap, or principal components for 130 years to find good macro variables in terms of which to learn the macro equations. Principal components is something that, as I said, is around for a long time, but data have to live on hyperplanes. And in 2000, there was these back-to-back papers in Science, isomap and local linear embedding, followed by diffusion maps and Laplacian eigenmaps. And so now I want to tell you when it is the first time that we run into this problem using autoencoders. So to my knowledge, the paper that we saw was one by Mark Kramer in 1991. He was a chemical engineer. He called these nonlinear principal components. If somebody knows a previous reference, please tell me. I'm really interested. So the idea is exactly that you have a very large vector in your variables, like all the plankton microorganisms, and you use an autoencoder in order to create a coarse-grained macroscopic observation in which then you can learn evolution equations. Diffusion maps is our particular poison for doing this. These are a couple of slides for, let's say, getting three-dimensional data that live on a 2D manifold, and being able to understand that they are on a 2D manifold, and having a set of coordinates on this 2D manifold. The point is, this is the equations, this is the variables in terms of which we would like to learn macroscopic equations. And so I'd like to take you to about 30 years ago. This is a paper that has a horrible title. It's called Discrete versus Continuous Signal Processing of Electrodissolution Data. and it's in a journal that is extremely obscure. It's in 1992, and I'll tell you why I like it. It had, what we did is that we had lots of time series from the experimental corrosion, if you want. This is dissolution of copper in hydrochloric acid. John Hudson was the experimentalist. And what you see is that we had lots and lots of time series. And these time series were each obtained at a different parameter value, a different potential between the metal that was dissolving and an electrode. And you see that you can get from having, let's say, steady solutions to periodic solutions to period double solutions. And down here are the reconstructions with time delays, tachons, embeddings, and you see you go from steady to limit cycles to period doublings and to chaotic attractors. And we only had the data. So we wanted to learn a set of differential equations depending on parameters that can reproduce the data and the bifurcations between them. And what we did is, since we had discrete data in time, okay, is that we created what is a Runge-Kutta resonance. That is, we created a neural network that is recurrent, as you see. And if you look on the right, you see that it is one-to-one with the architecture, if you want, of a Runge-Kutta 454 integrator. You take the input, you pass it through the network, you get f of the input. Then you take this result, you multiply it with a small number, you add it to the input, and then you go through the network again and again and again. And so this recurrent network architecture, which incidentally you can see is a residual network, what I'm learning is the difference between the original point and the final one, is really an embodiment of a Runge-Kutta integrator. So this is something that I'd like to often think, that a lot of the beautiful architectures that are found to be useful, if you look at them carefully, you find that there is an analogy with a standard numerical analysis algorithm that you know and love. And there is a reason for this. Maybe the dynamical systems people will appreciate this more. If you learn a time one map between data, there is a big difference. You can be very qualitatively and quantitatively predictive, but the long-term dynamics of discrete time systems are qualitatively very different than the long-term dynamics of continuous time systems. So discrete time maps don't have limit cycles. They have invariant circles that have resonances and very different bifurcations. Why I'm saying this? Because you can be beautifully predictive, but if you want to understand the bifurcations by learning a discrete time map, you're going to be completely wrong. So it's important that you learn the right-hand side and not the time one map from data. So this is the standard ResNet, which is now has 95,000 citations, and it really is forward Euler. As many of you, all of you know, you don't fit the time one map, but you fit the equation, which if integrated with an Euler method would give you the same result. So this is related with backward error analysis and numerical analysis. Long story short, we were very happy back then because we did get our variables from windows of the time series through autoencoders, and then we used recurrent resonance to learn the right-hand side of the equations, and we got beautiful reconstruction of the time series, but also of the right dynamics. This was a steady state that lost stability to Hopf bifurcation, and then there was a period doubling and so on and so forth. We did a lot of other things also motivated back then from traditional numerical analysis. For example, if you take a Crank-Nicholson, this gives you, and you want to create a neural network architecture that embodies a Crank-Nicholson, then this is an implicit neural network. You need to solve equations to evaluate it. So training these things was slightly non-trivial. We didn't have automatic differentiation, or we didn't know how to use it well. And this made a huge difference. We had to wait for weeks for our neural networks to converge before we would know if there is a result or not. And we did a very good job in predicting attractors and time series and whatever. I also want to mention a few other things from back then. One of the things that's very important is that if you learn time one maps, either through integrators or through neural networks, these are usually non-invertible. People don't usually think that integrators are non-invertible, but you should know that if you do forward Euler will in general be non-invertible. One point will go to one point, but there could be, if you go backwards, there would be, depending on the problem, 1, 2, 5, many backward things. And so you can learn a beautiful predictor, but if you again try to look at long-term dynamics, or you use it for bigger time steps than you learned it for, then you can get qualitatively wrong instability. So just this is the statement, is non-invertibility is something that is also inherent in integrators, and non-invertibility neural networks was one of the things studied back then. Another thing that we played with was gray box identification. If you know 5 pieces of a differential equation, but you don't know one of them, then having these recurrent nets is very convenient in learning only the part that you don't know. And more recently, the same idea used numerical integrators in order to learn the right-hand sides of dynamical systems. So this is a paper from last year. We used this in order to, so we used Euler, Maruyama, and Milstein, and Hoyne, and so on and so forth as templates for neural networks to learn stochastic differential equations. It's not particularly important. So, you know, you run lattice calculations, you know from physics that there exist effective SDEs for the mean field variables. So you learn these effective SDEs and you compare them with theory, and you see when they deviate from the theory, when the assumptions of the theory are not very good. The thing that I am now getting close to, what I do want to talk to you about, is learning partial differential equations from data using neural networks. So this is something we had played with around the end of the 90s. And it's very important for me to say what I mean when I say learning PDEs. I don't mean learning the solutions of PDEs. This is something that happens a lot today. I actually mean learning the laws of the PDEs. So if you think of a parabolic partial differential equation, what it really is a relation between the time derivative of a field and the value, and some spatial derivatives of the field, and some parameters probably also. So independent of whether, if you want, the Navier-Stokes is turbulent, or if it is quiescent, or if it is gently swirling, at every point in space and time, this relation exists. Every point in space and time of a solution of a PDE, independent of what the nature of the behavior is, gives you a data point for learning the law of the PDE. And so what we did back then is that we took little stencils, and this is now convolutional neural networks. You take little stencils, you calculate through standard formulas and finite differences, get a few local derivatives, and then you train a multi-layer perceptron, which is what we did then, to learn the relation between these few local derivatives in space plus some parameter values and the time derivative. This is what happens at one point in space. Now, if you slide this window, again, as I said, this is convolutional neural networks in space, and then recurrent neural networks in time let you learn the right-hand sides of partial differential equations from discrete space-time data. And again, this is kind of the way that I like to think about it. You see that things that are extremely successful have their analogs in standard numerical algorithms, e.g., something as simple as finite differences and Runge-Kutta methods. And this is kind of, running simulations of a burgers and then getting the data and learning the burgers, or the Kuramoto-Sivashinsky that we did back then. One thing that maybe is a little bit interesting is, what if I don't have PDE data, but I have microscopic agent-based molecular evolution data, and I want to learn a macroscopic partial differential equation, so that the inner code that produces the data is a Monte Carlo agent-based one, while the macro one is one for a partial differential equation. Let me give you a very simple example. It comes from chemotaxis. I don't know if you know how wonderful the locomotion of E. coli is. They have flagellae. The flagellae can kind of move clockwise together, and the thing runs, or counterclockwise, and the thing tumbles. And there is a beautiful way by which this allows you to learn that you live in a gradient of food, so that you go in the direction where there is more food. What I want to show you is a simulation in which we run 5,000 bacteria, and each bacterium in this case, each E. coli in this case, is a whole bunch of coupled deterministic and stochastic differential equations. There is intrinsic states for each one of them. There is random variables that are the flagellae. They are all running around and feeling the chemoattractant field. And what you're going to see is 5,000 bacteria that start in some sense at some place in space. And what we're going to do is we're going to run them. The bacteria are either blue or yellow or green, depending on whether they are tumbling, they are running right, or they are running left. And what you are going to see in the middle, the green is the profile of the food. The bacteria that are blue are going to move towards where there is more food. You're going to see that there is two curves. One is the blue curve, that is the learned partial differential equation for the bacterial density. What you will see in red is an observation of the PDF of the microscopic simulation that's running in parallel. And what you're going to see here is how many of the guys go left, how many of them go right, and how many of them are tumbling. It's just a quick success story because it worked quite nicely. You're going to see that we can look at the micro simulation, And knowing what the macro variable is, what's the bacterial density, then we can learn a macroscopic evolution equation for the evolution of the chemotactic evolution of the bacterial density. And in this plot, we learned the entire right-hand side of the PDE. And in the next plot, we assumed we knew the diffusion part, but we didn't know the chemotaxis part. So we did a gray box, and it kind of again worked. The point that I'm trying to make more than anything else is that you can have microscopic simulators to produce the inner data. And then if you know what the right macro variables are, you can learn macro PDEs from these simulations. So this also worked. I can play it, but I mean, at some point you see there's a little of a discrepancy, but the important thing is you don't learn the solution of the PDE, you learn the right-hand side or a good approximation of the right-hand side of the PDE. One of the things that's important to say, I don't know if you have thought about it or you encountered it, if you have data in the same way that the equation x equals 0 has the root 0, and x squared equals 0 has the root 0, and x over 1 plus x also has the root 0. There is many PDEs that are consistent with the same data. So it becomes very interesting to figure out among all of these PDEs, which is the one that you would like to keep and write in your paper. They are all on these data, they are all equivalent to each other. They produce the same thing. On nearby data also. So it's a very interesting question. If you have several things that are consistent on the data, which one you choose? How do you regularize? Based on knowledge, based on, it's an interesting question. One thing that I wanted to also say is that I showed you this kind of recurrent Runge-Kutta architecture. And what I want to tell you in this is that if you hardwire the architecture, but you leave the inner box unknown, then you learn the particular differential equation. But if you take many inner boxes and you hardwire those, and you let the outside architecture unknown, so this recurrent architecture, how many recurrences and how, then you learn the algorithm. And it becomes then very interesting to see how you can create superstructures. We have some. So that if you train the superstructures, you basically do meta-learning. You're finding the architectures that are integrating a class of differential equations. You can think of it a little as personalized algorithms. You choose what class of equations you want to learn to integrate, and then you create architectures that can integrate successfully these equations. It may be worth saying also that if you really think about this architecture a little, a recurrent architecture basically allows you to get the function and get its derivatives and the action of its Jacobians and the Hessians. So really, a recurrent architecture has all it needs to be a Krylov-based matrix-free solver. And so the same architecture is capable of both being trained to be an integrator or to be able to be, let's say, a fixed point solver or an eigensolver. It just changes. Well, it's very simple for me to say. Discrete optimization is a horrible thing. I'm afraid of it. Nevertheless, it is interesting that the same basic structure can let you, either you hardwire the architecture and you learn the model, or you choose the class of models and then you learn the architecture that does the job. And if you give some cost on how many connections and how wide the networks and how difficult to train them and how big this, if you just give a cost to what you do, then you can think of finding the architecture that does the job and minimizes the cost. In a sense, you can use optimization to do optimal algorithms. And we had a nice, or I'd like to think it's a nice paper a couple of years ago on this with Alex Mitsos, who is an optimization guy. Again, discrete optimization is a difficult thing. Okay, so after telling you all of this old stuff, I want to tell you something that I would like to think of as fun and hopefully interesting. What if you try to learn partial differential equations and you have data and you don't really know what the right space or what the right time to use in the PDEs is? I will explain. A few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, DARPA had a shredding contest. They took some documents and shredded them. They posted the pieces and they asked people to put them back together again. If some of you have seen the movie Argo, that's exactly what happened. The Americans, when they left Iran, they didn't have time to burn the documents and then they shredded them. And the Iranians put a lot of people, Wikipedia says they were skilled carpet weavers. They put them in a room and they said, here is all the strings, the shredded paper, put them back together. And they did. So think of this as a partial differential equation. This is space and this is time. This is the solution of the equation. Somebody gives you shreds of the solution, and then you're trying to put it back together. So Gal would like this because she has done some of this. So here's then a partial differential equation, a Ginzburg-Landau in 1D. This is space, this is time. This is the solution. You see there's coherent spatiotemporal messy patterns. You take this picture as it comes out of the printer, and then you take it to the office shredder, and you shred it, and you get 512 time series, and you mix these time series up, and it's a horrible mess. But putting them back together is solving a puzzle, because they're pieces of a puzzle. They are smooth. Because the PDE is smooth, there is smooth changes in space-time. And so you can use manifold learning techniques to take all of these shreds and put them back together again. What you're going to do is that you're going to find the right proximity, but if you think about it for a moment, there's no way for you to tell if it is right, left, or left, right. So actually we reconstruct here a space, and if you look at it very carefully, you will see that it's flipped. But you get the right neighbor. So you get a space, which is not exactly the original one, but is isomorphic to it or diffeomorphic to it, any conjugate to it, invertibly transformable to it. Here's the same idea in 2 dimensions. You take a PDE in 2-dimension space plus time. This is the solution. You pass it through a meat grinder. You get lots and lots and lots of time series. They are a mess. But then if you do data mining on them, you find that there is a 2-parameter family of time series, and you find that there exists an emergent space. So this is a data-driven physical space. So it's a data-driven geometry. And in this space, nearby points have nearby behavior. And if you look at it with your eyes, as I am pointing now between right and left, you will see that, again, this space is one-to-one with the original geometric space that we somehow destroyed when we shredded the data. We can reconstruct something that is one-to-one with it, and then we can kind of learn the partial differential equation in this new emergent space. This is for the people that discretize PDEs. You know that if you discretize a 2D PDE with the usual kind of lexicographic ordering of the nodes, you're going to get a banded structure. If you name the nodes randomly, you get a horrific adjacency matrix, because node 5 is not next to node 4 now, so this looks like a mess. But if you look at the behavior that takes place on these nodes, then you can recreate a geometry which is one-to-one with the original geometry. So an emergent space is a physical space, not the physical space, is a data-driven space in which nearby actors do nearby things, and it is a convenient space in which to learn a partial differential equation. Here is an example. This comes from Steve Strogatz's work on coupled oscillators. You have something like 800 coupled oscillators. They each have 2 components, X and Y. They're all coupled together. It's an all-to-all coupling. You see that I have them when they are ready to start. They're all heterogeneous. Each one of them is slightly different. And if you run them, you will see very quickly that they organize themselves along a curve. You see, I was very smart in how I colored them, so that the color along this curve is a good variable for describing the behavior. So they organize themselves. This is just coupled agents now. There is no geometry. The geometry, this one-dimensional geometry, arises from the dynamics itself. So God help us, it's an emergent PDE in this emergent coordinate. If you plot the angle in this emergent coordinate, you will see that it will look like an evolving partial differential equation. If you plot the amplitude as a function of this emergent coordinate, you will see that it looks like a partial differential equation. So we are going to learn these partial differential equations in a space which has been emerged, if you want, by data mining the action itself. So, this is the same type of thing, but in a kind of a different cute picture. I like to think it's cute. You see, I started with a whole bunch of points. They organized themselves, and now you see that if I plot it intelligently, it very much looks like a PDE evolving in space-time, while what you really have is just individual agents dancing around. So this is exactly the problem that I told you before. The oscillators are, they're coming also from a Ginzburg-Landau coupled partial differential equation. Maybe the details are not important. This is a complex equation written up here. You see that they organize themselves along a curve. And if I plot this curve and I color them on this curve by where they started, you see that I get a horrible mess. But if I color them not based on where they started, but where they found themselves after some time, then it looks much smoother. What am I really telling you? You look at the individual oscillators numbered from 1 to 200, it looks like a horrible mess of spaghetti. If you do data mining on these trajectories, you find that there really are a one parameter family of trajectories, and there is a diffusion map coordinate phi1, so that if you plot these, not in terms of their label, but in terms of phi1, then it looks like a nice field. And then I can go and learn the PDE in the nice field. So this is what Felix Hemeth did. He plotted these oscillators in terms of this data-driven coordinate and saw that their behavior in time looks like a partial differential equation. And then we used pretty standard things in order to learn the evolution of the oscillator state as a function of its state and its partial derivatives with respect to this emergent variable. All of these old tools, but now with automatic differentiation. And what we did is that we were able to learn this PDE, and not only were we able to do simulations, but we were also able to do bifurcation calculations. Here there is a parameter that is changing. For some range of the parameter values, everything goes to a stationary state. For another range, it goes to a spatio-temporal oscillation. There is a Hopf bifurcation. We can look at all of this. Basically, the point is, it's not surprising. Neural ODs do this in current time, and neural PDEs, if you want. There's lots and lots of such papers. But the idea is, well, you know, the old professor said all of this is wrong, and I published it first anyway. That's not exactly true. There is a lot of much more beautiful things today, but being able to learn PDEs is an old thing that's revived today. The interesting thing that I'm telling you now is, here we just have disorganized data. We don't know what the space variable is in which to learn the PDE. That's the thing that's interesting in what I'm showing you. This is another class of coupled oscillators. There's two parameters now, and because there's two parameters, the oscillators don't live along a string, but they live along a surface. You can think of the oscillators as a sort of random discretization points on the appropriate space. By doing data mining, you can figure out what the appropriate space is, and then you can learn the evolution of these oscillators in this appropriate space as a two-dimensional PDE. And here you see what the oscillators are doing, and then under them you see the effective surface that data mining discovered they live on. You see phi1 and phi2 are the space variables that emerged from data mining the behaviors of all of the oscillators. And then what we did is that we learned a PDE for running these, for running this PDE model of the many coupled oscillators. One of the things that's important to say, I don't know if you see these little black curves, straight lines at the edge of the evolving surface. To run a PDE, you need boundary conditions. And boundary conditions for a PDE whose right-hand side you don't know is not a very easy thing to find. So this is a whole very interesting thing. If you learn an operator as a black box, what are sufficient boundary conditions, and how do you test this? I will tell you a little bit more about it at the end. But what we did here is that we prescribed what happens in the little corridors outside the black square, and then we use the PDE to fill in what happens inside. And a more realistic example of this, in the example that I showed you at the beginning, there was physical space, and I shredded it myself and pretended I didn't know it, and asked data mining to put it back together. Here is a problem where you have not all-to-all, but a Chung-Lu network of Hodgkin-Huxley oscillators. So each one of these things is a bunch of differential equations. There is 1,024 such systems coupled together. They are all heterogeneous in their parameters. They're heterogeneous in the way that they're coupled. You look at what they do, you see here there's lots and lots of little closed curves, because each neuron is doing something different. They're all synchronized, but each is doing a slightly different oscillation. You analyze these oscillations, you find that there are two parameter family of oscillations. This means that for all practical purposes, you can think of this horrible network of neurons as a discretization, as a random discretization of a 2D partial differential equation. And we find the space variables, the emergent space variables in which we can learn this partial differential equation. And in this particular problem, it turns out that we also can say something about interpretability. You take these coordinates and you color them by the intrinsic heterogeneity. And you see that one of these coordinates is 1-to-1 with the intrinsic heterogeneity. And on the other side, you color the found coordinates by the degree of the neuron in the network. If you want the structural inhomogeneity, and you find that the second variable phi2 is pretty close to that. So if you have some domain scientist to give you a good guess of, you tell them two variables are important, they give you a guess of the two variables, and then you can very easily check on the data whether they are one-to-one with each other. And so what you see is here is that these 1,024 oscillators, that if you plotted them individually, it would be 1,024 messy time series. You find the right way of representing them and learning their interactive dynamics. And then it looks like, we like to call this a flag kind of waving in the wind, in effect, a discretization of a PDE. So you can find geometry even if it is not physical. You can find a good geometry in which to represent the problems. Another thing that I want to chat, I told you about learning a PDE. There is also a lot of work these days on PINs. PINs is physics-informed neural networks. You use neural network basis functions to solve the partial differential equation. And in what we're doing here, we're basically prescribing the equation in a corridor, the data, learn the equation from the prescribed data, and then use the learned equation to solve the equation, to fill in the places that we don't have the PDE. So this is an in-painting problem in which you learn a PDE and use the PDE to in-paint, if you want. There is one more thing that I want to say here is that the way that the world is today, you may have not just simple boundary conditions, but you may have the data prescribed in various very random and messy domains. So it's very interesting to figure out, are the data enough? Do you have a well-posed problem if somebody gives you data prescribed in several random, not just on the usual boundary and initial? So what I want to show you is a nice example of solving the equation with a plot of prescribed data, and then using this to try to figure out, is the problem well posed or not? This is the Kuramoto-Sivashinsky. It is a one-space, one-time evolution equation. You prescribe the data in these two corridors, and then you try and use pins to solve the equation in the rest of the domain. It must be pretty clear to you that here there is enough information to uniquely solve in this corridor. There is no information for a parabolic. What happens is that if you solve the problem variationally many times, then you find every time the same thing when the problem is well posed, and every time something different. You can kind of, forgive me, you can see it here. Every time something different when the problem is not well posed. So it is possible to use, if you want, manifold learning on the results of multiple parallel solutions of the problem to figure out where the problem is well posed and where it is. This is the wave equation, very nice example. It can be done. Let's say that you have the wave equation in this box prescribed. If you solve, you will find that you get, forgive me, I pressed the thing too many times. If you solve, what you're going to find is that every time you solve in this kind of tetragonal region, you get the same solution. And that's true because there are characteristics in the equation, but you find different solutions outside. So by solving variationally many times and studying the results, you can figure out, if you want, where the problem is well posed. You can try to extract that there are characteristics here. Normally, in numerical analysis, one would never solve a problem if it was not well posed already. But thank God, with the tools that we have today in machine learning and automatic differentiation, by solving the problem variationally, we can actually use the many solutions to explore the well-posedness of the problem and the boundary conditions. I'm going to try and give you a very little, maybe this is another example from the same problem. This is also the wave equation, but you prescribe the data in this part of the domain, and there is a reflection boundary condition here. You will, if you think about it a little bit and count characteristics, you will find that by giving this and this, you're prescribing the solution in this region, but you're also prescribing it in these deep blue places. And indeed, this is what you find when you do variational solutions. You find the same solution at those deep blue places and different things every time in the rest of the domain. Basically, I'm just telling you the idea that it is possible to use repeated variational solves to explore the well-posedness, over-parameterization or under-parameterization of a PDE problem. This is, I kept this because I wanted to say a few more things now. So using data and learning evolution equations consistent with the data is a very scary thing. It looks like you have a crystal ball, you're looking at the ball, you get results, but you don't know why they're there. You don't have a good mechanistic understanding. So like that, you show up, what do you want to tell me?
Can I?
You almost froze again.
Have the physics informed. Did you are the physical constraints encoded in the PDE, or are there somewhere else?
Okay. There is many answers in this. What is exactly kalled PINs today by Kevrekidis and group is not learning the partial differential equation, is using, if you want, neural network basis functions in order to solve the equation. That is PINs. Okay. In what I showed you, you learn the operator. You don't learn the solution. You learn the operator. Also today, with the Kevrekidis group and many other people have various versions. So DeepNet is one, and the Fourier net, and so on, for learning the operator. Okay. Now, when you learn the operator from the data, if you learn it black box, you really have learned no physics. I already told you, if you learn it gray box, for example, you know there is a diffusion term and you know there is a reaction term, but you don't know the convection term. Okay, now this is, I don't know how you'd like, but I understand that Kevrekidis, who is a friend, has patented the physics informed. So if you do a gray box where you know two pieces and you don't know the third, you're not allowed to say physics informed. Maybe you can say physics infused. But so you see, there is now in the spirit of the previous talk and the discussion about when do you say that an autoencoder matched two things, you can start asking, what is better? Is it better to put in as much physics as you know and learn black box what you don't know? Or is it, and this is my preference, is it interesting to take the physics that you know and then learn a diffeomorphism to the true physics? That is, learn a one-to-one transformation from something that you understand to something that is quantitatively different, but you don't exactly have a formula for. I think, in my opinion, and I am very happy to have beers and discuss this, that this way you have both understanding and quantitation. You have, because you have a map between something you understand, an invertible smooth map between something that you understand and something that is quantitative. Okay, but I was just trying to say there's many versions of this. You can learn right-hand sides in which you put in a certain invariance that you know. You can learn a right-hand side and you can some terms that you know and some invariants that you know. You can learn a right-hand side that you don't put anything in. That is all learning the operator. Separately from that, there is the issue of take neural network basis functions, for lack of another word, and then solve the equation with neural network basis functions, like do collocation on neural networks if you want. Why is this important? Good, because it is so easy to solve a PDE with Keras and doing collocation on neural networks. Okay, and there is very good work on the numerical analysis of doing collocation on neural networks. Collocation on neural networks is not the exact word. I'm just saying it as an example. You use the residuals at a number of points. Was I coherent, Soledad?
Thank you. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, good. Mm-hmm. So I told you about finding an emergent space, and now I want to kind of, I don't know, entertain you, if that is the right word. What if you have shredded data that where you not only have you lost the order in space, but you've also lost the order in time. So you take the same thing, but you shred it horizontally rather than shredding it vertically. And so you have all of these snapshots. I understand there was a company in California, you could send them a a whole bunch of photographs from your family mixed up over the years, and then they would put them in order. It is, again, a puzzle-solving data mining problem. It's easy to do. You can mix this up in time, and then you can order them with data mining. So not only can you find a good space in which to embed your data, but also a good time in which you can embed your data. And for that matter, you can take a cookie cutter and kind of chop space-time patches and have your data in space-time patches, and then be able to reconstruct a nice, smooth space-time in which you can embed them so that you can learn a generative model. So put them back together again. And so the point of this emergent space business is that, and this is going back to Whitney and Takens, is that whether you take PDE data, this is Kuramoto-Shivashinsky, you see it's traveling and modulated. So it's a torus, it's a modulated traveling wave. Whether you get data as short time series at a bunch of points, or whether you get data as short as little photographs at many moments in time, or whether you get little space-time patches, or whether you even have traveling observers, all of these things can be registered to each other. So this is data fusion. If you want, they can give you a good coherent space in which you can learn the evolution role. And so now we go to something that Koifman and Singer did. I don't know. I think it was 2008, using a Mahalanobis distance to do diffusion maps to register the data. So how do we fuse very different informations of the same thing? How do we understand that two very different sets of observations are really observations of the same thing, and we can map them to each other? So let's say that this is a God space. I hope I'm not offending somebody. This is how I look at the world, and on this side is how Soledad looks at the world. We take two data points, so we have to use the distance between two events, and that goes into our kernel when we do data mining. So let's say that in my world, I don't see the same thing as God sees. I have an observation function, and therefore in my world, these two data points are not the same distance from each other. But the interesting thing is, if I don't only look at the distance between the data points, but I also have a little sprinkling of nearby, so I have a little burst of simulation, a little bit of diffusion around each of the data points. I sample in a little neighborhood of the data points. Then if I observe what happens to this little Gaussian, the way that it deforms gives me a sense of the slope of my observation glasses at that point. And if I do this here, I get the same slope, an estimate of the slope of my observation function here. And so if I don't only took my data distance, but I took my data distance and the information about the local slope of my glasses, I can get the Mahalanobis distance between my points that can allow me to map my observations to the ones by God. And if Soledad has this observation curve, and this is how she observes the little noise around the original points, then what happens is that she can also map her observations to the original divine ones. And so if you look at this, I've made it on purpose, it looks like a lens. It allows me to map my observations of the world to Soledad. And so the idea is that if you do your data mining this is not easy, you have to have these extra information. But if you have this extra information, then you can do your data in a way that registers them to a prototypical Platonic, if you want. If you read Homan Ovadi's papers, he talks about Platonic forms of data mining. And one of the things that we did recently is, this is doable in the traditional paper and pencil Mahalanobis diffusion map way, but we also wrote a paper with Rafi Koifman and Erez Peter-Freund and Ophir Lindenbaum and Tom last year that showed up in PNS, which is to create a neural network that not only is an autoencoder, but it is an autoencoder. It has a little bit of a flavor of a variational autoencoder, if you want. It takes neighborhoods of points in the observation space and then maps them to a canonical space. So if you want, this is what is the right word? Z-scoring of the data. And so the idea then is that you can have very different models of the same thing that can be easily matched to each other. This is a trivial example from the paper of Koifman and Singer. You take a square, and whether you observe it this way or whether you observe it this way, if you do the data mining in the way that I told you, then you get two representations that are within an orthogonal transformation to each other. So this is a very nice way of also thinking of maybe even doing transport. You take things and you, by mapping them to the same original Platonic picture, then the change between them is just an orthogonal transformation. So it's much easier to find than trying to do procrustices and so on and so forth. We had a little paper that uses this idea on matching neural networks. Let's say that you have two neural networks that are observing, that are trained to do the same task. Can we match them? Can we look at the few neurons on the one network and the few neurons on the other network and be able to exactly say what everything on the one network is by just looking at a few things of the other? The idea, again, you have, I am saying it very quickly, I apologize. You have several rich enough observations of the same thing. If you do your data mining with a Mahalanobis information about the local slope, if you want, of the observation curve, then it becomes very easy to match one to the other. And we also are working very much on trying to do data mining close to infinity. Is what happens when the transformations between two things go to infinity, when two things cannot be mapped to each other anymore. This maybe has to do with, again, with the autoencoders in the previous talk. We have two things, they can be matched to each other, but as we try to generalize, at some point they cannot be matched to each other anymore. The transformation goes to infinity, and that for us is a good limit of generalization. So here is a few entertainment minutes at the end. I think that, so around the middle, you know, in the Renaissance, people found, understood the perspective, they found the point at infinity, and they made wonderful pictures that looked realistic. And for a very long time, people worked very hard at trying to be able to describe what they see. But in my mind, one of the big things about data mining is that we don't exactly have to represent what we see. We can work with any invertible, diffeomorphic, if you want, transformation. And therefore, it is possible to kind of show the same thing in many different ways. Here's the last thing that I kind of want to say. If you have, if there is something that you want to describe in the world, you would like your model to reproduce what you see in the world. So this is the Vitruvian Man. If you have a mirror, you would like the mirror to be to show you exactly what you wanted to describe. Usually a model is like a funhouse mirror. It's something that distorts what it is that you really want to see. What I want to do is that I want to take this picture and kind of change it. Let's say that you have, so think of a model as already a slight distortion of reality. Then it would be very interesting to take the distorted model and then find the mirror that takes it back to the truth. Here is a different distorted model. Here is the mirror that takes that model back to the truth. Here is yet another distorted model. Here is the mirror that takes it again back to the same truth. So the idea is that if we can do, if you want, if we do our data mining in a gauge invariant way, and we do that, and there are several very good people that are working on this. If you can do your data mining in a gauge invariant way, then we can match our models. And in principle, then it will also be possible to have partial data that are differently distorted and again match them to the truth. So a lot of the things that we do has to do these days, has to do with trying to do data mining. This takes extra information. It doesn't mean that it's trivial to do. But if you try to do your data mining in a way that is gauge invariant in some, sorry, again, it's a very short word for the whole concept, then we can match our models with each other. We can test the limits at which we can generalize to each other, and maybe we can learn our models not in our particular own language, but in the language in which the models are nicer. Koopman, for example, tries to learn the models in a space where everything is linear. I try to find a transformation to linearity. We work on transformation to flowbox. You want to think of transformations to integrability, if you want to be kind of way ambitious. So the important thing is, of all possible models of something, now that we can work with all of them, which is the one that we would like to put in our book? Which is the one that we would like to describe to our friend or compute with? Depending on what is it that you want to do with the model, you may have several equivalent diffeomorphic versions of the same thing. You would like to maybe compute with the one that is easier to compute with, but describe the one that is more interpretable. And so this idea of working with finding mirrors between different realizations of the same model, a mirror between the understandable and the quantitative, a mirror between the Anyway, at times I've tried to think of calling a talk like this on smoke and mirrors, and it has mirrors, but I cannot think of the right smoke. Maybe noise would be the smoke. Anyway, thank you. I hope this was not uninteresting.
Thank you so much, Yannis. That's great. Yeah. Do we have questions? Jeremias, do you want to start?
Yes, Jared.
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you, Yannis, for that amazing series of works. I'm curious about the comment that you made about lack of uniqueness in potential lack of uniqueness in some solutions.
Yes.
So in some areas that don't have to do with partial differential equations, sometimes people are very concerned about lack of uniqueness or under what assumptions we can claim uniqueness of solutions. Is that something that is a problem here, or maybe it is not, and it's a purely design question?
Good point. So there were two places. There were two places that I talked about uniqueness. There was the place about solving a PDE and wondering if there is a unique solution. That's important because you care about the solution. And then there was learning a law consistent with your data and wondering if I had a different law, does it matter? Okay, so you already know if you give the same data to you and Soledad and me and I don't know who else, each one of us will train something, we'll find something different, but it doesn't matter because it is predicting the same thing. I am oversimplifying. So at that level, if what you're interested in is the prediction, who cares about which particular element of the group of diffeomorphisms sits under your hood? Yes, but this is one, and at this level, it doesn't matter. Now, it's arguable because you see among all possible autoencoders, because you would like to describe your latent space to somebody else, maybe you'd like to be predictive, but maybe you'd like to say, these elements in my autoencoder correspond to these elements in yours. So sometimes it becomes interesting to have transformations between different, in principle, equally successful descriptions of the problem. But on the PDE, the problem is very different. You have some information, you want to know if this information you can get one solution or not, right? So there is a version of uniqueness in which it doesn't matter. It's more maybe a matter of aesthetics or ability to communicate. And there is another one in which it matters very much, because if you have a not well-posed problem, and as I said, you solve it variationally, every time you solve it variationally, you'll find something else. And one of these things is wrong. And that's your fault because you didn't have enough information. So I'm not sure if you're talking about the first one, where any autoencoder gives you a good result, or the second one, where if you don't have enough information, you get the wrong result. Different problems, right?
Yeah, precisely. I was talking about the latter.
So in the latter, the important question is, do I have enough information to have a solution?
Correct. And in that setting, is it understood, for example, how, what aspects of the data that I need to collect would ensure that that is not the case?
Yeah. So here, I know a few things, and there is a lot of things that I don't know. There is an amazing paper. It's in the Princeton Journal in 80. So well-posedness in math traditionally goes back to Adama. And there is okay, what they say in this paper, and he cites Poincaré and whatever in 1890 something, the basic statement is geometers typically work either with Dirichlet or Neumann or Robin boundary conditions. Okay, what I'm trying to tell you, and this is an opinion, and I am willing to be corrected, but for a very long time, we have learned to only give a certain type of boundary conditions. Okay, like here's the boundary of the domain I'm going to solve inside, and I have to prescribe initial. Okay, and we kind of more or less know what is well posed, and we only solve if it's well posed. And there's lots of work about what makes a well posed problem or not. However, today, as I said, you can get data in a patch here and in a patch there and in a patch there. And is this enough? Is it too much? Are they consistent with each other? Okay, it's not as if nobody in the world studies this. Everybody that does data assimilation says this problem. Here is the data. What is the most probable solution given what I know? In what I told you, so this is a whole world, and it is a wonderful world. there is a difference between this and the particular little twist that I told you. My twist is not there can be a little error in the operator and a little error in the data. What is the most probable thing? Do you understand? This is an extremely important question. And my question is, if I know the operator, do I have enough data to solve it or not? Are these data consistent or inconsistent? This is something that, to my knowledge, maybe I'm wrong. So a data-driven approach to traditional well-posedness usually doesn't come up. If somebody knows, by all means tell me. And I think that the reason that we talk about it today is because of all the machine learning programming machinery, it is very easy to solve a problem variationally 1,000 times, look at 1,000 times and say, what does it tell me? Up to now, if one solution takes a lot of effort, you're never going to try 1,000 variational solutions just in case and then do data mining of them. So the concept was always there. It's only now that I think it is practical to explore it. This is a personal view. By all means, whoever has thought or knows or whatever, send me references or tell. Okay? And by the way, this has nothing to do with neural networks. It's neural networks that allow you to do it very easily.
Correct.
You could do this variationally, math straight. But I mean, you can imagine somebody would be really crazy saying, you know, solve a PDE with wrong boundary conditions 1,000,000 times and do data mining on the 1,000,000 solutions and try and tell me something about it. The question could be asked, but it wouldn't be practical, I think, until now. Okay.
Adam, are you also speaking? We cannot hear you.
No. All right.
Maybe you can type the question, Adam.
Can you type it? Adam likes recurrent networks. Is it a recurrent question? We can do 20 questions.
So maybe in the meantime, I can ask you a question about what had changed in the philosophy from what you studied before and now.
Okay, there is one thing. So again, take it with a grain of salt. This is with somebody who was doing some of these things at that time. The point is that at that time, if you train an okay, I will tell you something that I think is I thought of a better answer. Autoencoders were available. It took, I'm overdoing it. I was not training them maybe very well, but it took like 3 days to train them. If the problem failed, there was no guarantee that the problem failed because there was a bug, because the code was wrong, the initial condition. I mean, it's a non-linear, non-convex optimization problem. You get no guarantees of any kind. And at the time, it took us days to get one answer. So when Koifman came along and told me I can make it into an eigenproblem and I can give you an answer for finding reduced variables, I thought that, you know, this is the sun is shining over darkness. You know, this problem that is impossible to solve is suddenly deterministically solvable given the data. And then the years go by, and even the people that did this do autoencoders now because, I don't know, is it the computers that are much better? Is it that we have much better training techniques? Is it just automatic differentiation? So what I'm telling you is that there is a part of it that has to do very much with practicality. If you have to wait for days to get the result, this is not a very fruitful direction. And now you can get a lot of results very fast. This now does not do justice to the fact that there is infinite beautiful math work on top of the hardware. But at the time, the thing that was extremely discouraging is that you had to wait for one training. Okay? This may not be a good answer, but again, I find it very funny that the people who, like, as I said, Rafi Koifman, who is one of my heroes, who actually was able to take this non-linear, non-convex problem and create a different version that had a unique answer, now does not so much use his own unique answer, but trains on autoencoder.
Interesting, yeah.
What about robustness of learning of diffeomorphism? Okay, so the quick answer is that I do not know, but I do have a nearby answer, which is you noticed that I said that we're working on trying to figure out when the diffeomorphism goes to infinity. So this is our attempt at trying to figure out how far we can go and still be able to diffeomorphically translate one to the other. And in the spirit of this, let me tell you that, and again, I would be very much interested if people want to tell me more information, but the usual neural network basis functions that we have don't have infinities in them, and you would have to have rational neural networks to have infinities. So infinities are very convenient for understanding when something transforms or doesn't transform. And this year I found a paper by a Cornell applied math guy called Townsend and his collaborators that had rational function neural networks because they were particularly interested in what happens with infinities. Okay, so I didn't answer. I told you a couple of not irrelevant things, but what we do is that we very much try to look at when is it, as we try to match things, that the diffeomorphism between them goes to infinity, and that tells us the limit at which it can go. It's not a perfect answer, but it's not uninteresting, I hope. Adam is nodding. Good.
Okay, Yannis, thank you so much. I'm going to take you up on the offer of discussing this for beers. Yes, thank you so much.
Again, this is very personal. It's not necessarily correct. Okay, see you guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay. Hi, Bruno.
Hey, can you hear me well?
Yes, perfect.
Good. Okay, should I share my screen?
Yeah, let's see if you can share it.
Okay. Okay, should be able to see now my
yes, perfect.
slide.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
let me introduce you. So our next speaker is Bruno Loureiro from EPFL. He's a postdoctoral researcher, and he got his PhD from Cambridge, University of Cambridge in 2018 in physics. And he works in machine learning and statistical physics. So let's thank him for his talk, and he's going to talk about exactly solvable models for learning with realistic data.
Okay, thank you very much, Soledad, and thank you to our organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak here. It's my second time at DeepMath, and it's always very nice. So thank you for that. So today I'm going to be speaking about two works done in collaboration with a bunch of people that I'm going to introduce once I speak about each one that are going to appear in NeurIPS this year, and they are all about structured data. So everybody knows that data is key, and actually we have heard a lot about that so far from different perspectives. And if you speak with practitioners of machine learning, actually they're going to emphasize this even more, that a lot of their time is spent like actually cleaning data and doing feature selection, because this has a huge impact on the performance of the models they are trying to fit. Yet, if you think about theoretical analysis of machine learning, data is often not playing a very important role. So actually there are two philosophies of thought, I would say roughly, about how to analyze data. The first one is to completely neglect the role of data. So try to derive some theoretical guarantees for the generalization of the statistical models that we are interested, that are agnostic or uniform over the data, in the sense that you're trying to get these guarantees without assuming anything about the distribution of the data. And while discounted bounds, so here I have in mind classical bounds like VC bounds and so on, based on the complexity of the models, they provide a very nice description of a generalization in the classical regime, where you have a lot of data compared to the complexity of the model class. We all know that they fall short in the modern regime, where the complexity of the models that you're trying to analyze is of the same order of the data. So of course there are many approaches to fix this, and one of them would be pack-based, for instance. But there is also another school of thought, which is typical case analysis. So in this case, instead of trying to obtain uniform guarantees for the performance of our models, we try to model the structure of the data. So we assume a certain distribution for the data, and then we try to analyze the performance of the model on this distribution of the data. Of course, this suffers from the opposite problem, in the sense that if your model for the data is poor, like for instance, if you assume that your data is just white noise, then the results that you're going to get are going to be just too specific to this distribution of the data that you're assuming. So if you think a little bit about the problem, we don't know how to model very structured, like for example, what is the distribution of images. So the whole challenge of the second philosophy of thought is actually to find models which are rich enough to capture certain aspects of what we observe in practice, yet remain analytically tractable. We can say something analytically. So that's the philosophy of thought, and that's the biggest challenge. So in these two works, our goal is going to be to build some models for structured data and try to argue that these models that we can solve, they can say something about what is going on in practice. There's going to be very simple, because we want to have an exact mathematical analysis of learning in these problems. So the first such model is going to be a Gaussian covariate model. So this work done in collaboration with this bunch of people, like Cédric Gerbelot, who is also participating here at DeepMath, Hugo Cui, also at EPFL, Sébastien Gaud at CISA, Florent Jacala at EPFL, Marc Mézard at École Normale Supérieure, and Lenkas Deborova at EPFL. So let's dive into the model. So the model works as follows. So we want to generate some data. Let's say we draw two sets of covariates, U and V, and we draw n samples, identical samples of that. And we assume these are Gaussian variables with a certain covariance structure. So they are correlated. Then let's assume also that we have a set of weights, which we're going to call theta 0. We're going to call them the teacher weights, and it's fixed. Then we're going to have a teacher function. So if you, depending on the community you are, maybe you are more used to talk about generative model for data or an oracle function, but these are all the same thing. So this teacher is going to take the covariates U, and I'm going to generate the labels Y by taking the dot product between U and theta 0. So this is what I'm going to call the teacher model. My data set is going to be the pairs of covariate V and the labels Y. So note here that I'm not taking the covariates that were used by the teacher to generate the labels. I'm mismatched, so not necessarily this is going to be a realizable rule. So I'm going to take in the V. However, V is correlated with U, and that's why there is something to be learned, because if V was independent of U, then the labels would just be random. So on the other hand, my model to learn this data set is going to be what I call a student, or you can think as a statistician. And the student will try to learn this linear model to generate, this generalized linear model to generate the data, also with a generalized linear model. But the statistician has only access to the data. So it has only access to V and Y. So it doesn't know the covariates of the teacher, nor the teacher weights. So how learning is going to take place? So just as usual, we're going to be doing empirical risk minimization. So we're going to be minimizing the empirical risk with a regularization. So here I'm going to put a L2 regularization, but the framework of the paper cover other kinds of regularization as well. I have a loss function. It can be a genetic loss as long as it's convex. And my goal is going to be to characterize the performance of the learning of the statistician or of the student, And the performance is going to be measured by the training and generalization errors, which I define as follows. And in particular, I'm going to be interested exactly in the limit where the classical theories fall short, which is the high dimensional limit, where the number of samples, the number of parameters, the number of teacher and student covariates go to infinity, while the ratios are kept fixed. So in this work, our main result is a theorem that tells you that these errors that you're interested, which are high dimensional quantities in principle, they can be completely characterized by some scalar functions. And these scalar functions depend on two parameters, which are real numbers, m and q. And these m and q, they solve a self-consistent set of equations. So that's the usual asymptotic kind of result that we have. So here I'm going to show you the equations. So you don't need to panic. They are like very cumbersome, ugly, but the idea here is not for you to understand the details. You can go to the paper for that. But let me just point out that the equations depend on the sample complexity, which is the number of samples per number of features. It depends on the ratio between the teacher and student spaces. It depends on the joint empirical distribution that you can derive from the covariances. And finally, it depends on the loss function and on the regularization that you chose for learning. Okay, so this is a scalar formula. It looks ugly, but once you fix these quantities, you can take it, you can put in your computer, and you can solve it, and you can get the errors. So this is our main result, and is a theorem. So let's look at some applications. So the first application I want to discuss is the random features model. So this is a model that was introduced to model kernel learning. And here we're going to see that we're going to analyze that. Now, in the random features model, your features are a random projection of the covariates up to nonlinearity. And if you look at this, you're going to say, okay, this is not Gaussian. So how this can fit the model that assumes that covariates are Gaussian? So in the past few years, we actually have realized that even though these features are not Gaussian, and the distribution is not Gaussian, for the purpose of computing the error, all that you need is the first and second order statistics. So there is a concentration phenomena happening in high dimensions that even though the features are not Gaussian, they can be described by a Gaussian model. So this was an observation that appeared first in the context of kernels back in 2010 with work of El Karawi and so on. Then it was rediscovered by Gold et al. And Montanari and May in 2019 in the context of random features. And then there was a series of works that actually established rigorously that this is true for the random features model. And as I was saying, this is a concentration phenomenon that happens in high dimensions, and is something that the statistician David Donohoe called the blessing of dimensionality, that actually also Stefan spoke yesterday, is this amazing fact that in high dimensions, things would seem very hard to characterize, actually concentrate, and you just need low order statistics to describe them. So now, if you take this into account, you compute the covariances of random features and you plug in our formula, does it work? Yes, it works amazingly well. Here I'm plotting the error versus the sample complexity, or actually 1 over the sample complexity, the number of features by samples, for learning with both logistic laws and the square laws. And here you can see that the simulations, which are the dots, match very well the theory, which are the solid line curves. So it works pretty well, even in it's relatively small dimensions like p equals to 200 in this setting. So, okay, we have this Gaussian equivalence that is rigorously proven for the random features model. But this work that we did back in 2020, like we started asking, how big is this equivalence? Actually, can we extend this equivalence beyond just the case of random features? So in a certain sense, if you think about the space of equivalence classes, that the error can only be described by second order statistics, we know that there's a Gaussian model there, we know that there is a random features there rigorously, but are there any other cases that are there? So this led us to go into the direction of thinking, how can we, if other settings could also be described by this Gaussian model? And this brings me to my second case study, which is with generative models. So the idea is the following. We're going to start with a real data set. Choose your favorite data set. Here I have Cypher 10. I'm going to train a neural network or any model that you want to actually fit this data set. So this neural network is going to learn some features, and the last layer are going to learn some, is going to be fitting these features. So I'm going to take this first layers to be the teacher feature map and the last layer to be the teacher weights. Now, I have a model that can generate labels for this data. Now let's train a generative model to reproduce the data from this data set. Now here I'm putting an example like a gun, like a DC gun, that I'm training this gun to generate some realistic images from Gaussian noise. And of course, I'm going to use now my teacher that I have trained on the original data set to generate the labels for this realistic gun data. And now I have a pipeline, like kind of a Markov chain that I start from Gaussian noise. I can generate teachers, and I can use my teacher to generate labels. And this defines me some data. And the question is, now I can compute, since I have the teacher covariance and I have the teacher weights, I can choose any student that I want. I can choose any architecture that I want, and I can compute this covariance. I can plug in my formula, and I can see, well, my formula works for Gaussian, but does it describe well the learning in data generated by this setting? And quite surprisingly, it works pretty well. So here I'm showing a student that is trying to fit data that was generated by a DC gun trained on Cypher 10. My teacher was a neural network, and I'm taking my student to be another neural network that I have trained on this data, has 2 layers. This defines me a feature map, and then I'm retraining the last layer, and I'm analyzing the retraining of that last layer. And I'm plotting different curves, different epochs, or different levels of features that have been learned. So first, epoch 0 means the random features. Epoch 5, like you learn over five goes over the data set and so on, up to epoch 200. And as you can see, the theory, the Gaussian theory, is describing quite well the learning of this last layer. So this is quite surprising. Specifically here, I'm doing logistic regression. So this little bump that you see here, since the regularization is going to 0, and so this is the max margin estimator, responds exactly to the separability of this structured data generated by this generative model. So this was quite cool. We tried this with many different kinds of DC guns, many different kinds of data sets that we trained different generative models like autoencoders, guns, normalizing flows, and so on. And it seems to work pretty well. We have this concentration phenomenon in high dimensions. So, okay, I have other results about that, but since I don't have much time, let me jump into a second case study, which is, okay, we have described data that comes from a generative model. Can we actually push this further to actually describe real data? So can we describe like data that comes directly from real data sets with this formula? Now, if you think a little bit about the formula and you stare at it, the biggest problem about using real data is that we don't know what is the teacher that generated the labels and the features. So how can we plug and compute these covariances that enter in our formula? So we don't know the teacher weights and we don't know the teacher features that generated the distribution of the labels. So there is one particular case that we can say something. And if you look at the formulas, you realize that actually the teacher features and the teacher weights only enter in specific combinations on the formula. And actually, if your teacher is assumed to be a linear interpolator, then all these quantities that appear in the formula can directly be expressed in terms of the labels. In other words, for the purpose of generalized linear estimation, all linear teachers are equivalent. All of them gives the same performance. And now you can assume that the data that you have, like let's say you take MNIST, let's assume that MNIST was generated by a linear teacher. Let's take the labels of MNIST, let's take the covariance of MNIST, and let's try to plot in our formula and see what we get. And again, surprisingly, there is some sort of universality and things work pretty well. So here I'm showing also a student that has 2 layers. These 2 layers have been trained at different epochs on MNIST, and I'm freezing the features learned at every epoch, and then I'm just retraining the last layer, and I'm analyzing the retraining of the last layer of the square laws here. And as you can see here, since I'm doing regression, this peak now is the interpolation peak, is when the system becomes linearly invertible. And as you can see, as you learn better and better features, this peak is moving to the left, meaning that I'm learning a lower and lower rank representation of the data. So it's quite interesting. So we can also play the same game with other feature maps. Doesn't need to be a neural network. So here my student can be no transform at all, scattering transform, kernel methods, random features, whatever. And it seems to be working quite well in the case of regression. However, as soon as we get out of the context of regression, for example, if you take a logistic regression binary classification where your teacher is not a linear interpolator, the formula seems to break down. So this universality seems to hold only when you have linear regression on linear teachers. As soon as you have like things depending on the sign of the scalar product, you seem to need higher order moments to actually describe this. So this led us to our second model that I want to discuss here today, which is Gaussian mixture models. So this is joint work with Gabriele Sicuro at King's College London, always Cédric at École Normale, Florent and Lenka at EPFL, and Alessandro Paco, who was a master student at EPFL. And in particular, this second part of the talk is going to be quite brief, but Cédric has a poster about it in DeepMath as well. So after that, you can just go to Cédric and speak to him. He's also the mathematician of the team. So he's also the guy who knows all the details about the proofs, if you are interested, about how he used these two proofs techniques in these two different models. Okay, so let's leave this for the poster. So in the Gaussian mixtures, you don't have a teacher. Actually, instead of generating a label condition on your data, you are generating your data condition on your labels, a different philosophy of generative model. And here I'm going to take a Gaussian mixture which has genetic means and genetic covariances. And as before, my kind of results or the kind of theorem that Cédric has proven is that the generalization and the training errors in this high dimensional limit concentrate into something which is a scalar, only depends on scalar quantities that satisfy a self-consistent set of equations. Now, I'm not going to even show you the formula for this one because we are doing K-class classification. So all the order parameters are like K by K matrices, and it's very horrible, but you can go to the paper to check for details. And now we are going to play the same game. We are going to assume that this Gaussian mixture model can be used to describe the features from real data. And we're going to see, does it work better than the single Gaussian case in which you just have a Gaussian covariant model? And it seems that we are getting better, like a better description of the realistic data using a Gaussian mixture model. So here I'm taking again my student to be a two-layer neural network that has been trained on the real data and has been fixed at a certain training. I'm retraining the last layer with logistic regression. And however, the only difference that I'm approximating the data using a Gaussian mixture model instead of my Gaussian covariant model. And we are seeing, it seems that sometimes it works better than other times. So we don't see this strong universality that we are seeing in the linear case. And as for example, here I'm showing another example where the features are, instead of being a neural network, just is the identity. So I'm just directly linearly fitting the data and approximating MNIST with two Gaussian clouds. So here I'm doing binary classification. So I'm taking like, I don't know, odd versus even, and I'm fitting the covariances of odd and of even. And I'm learning with logistic regression. I'm considering as if MNIST was this Gaussian mixture model, fitting the covariance and trying to describe it with my formula. And here you can see that it doesn't work as well as, for example, when my features are a neural network. So and this just points out to the fact that for classification, the geometry of the data seems to matter much more than for regression. So here is a simple example where I generated some Gaussian mixture, 4 clusters, and I'm trying to fit them as if they were only 2 clusters. And I'm choosing different ways of labeling them, and I'm seeing that by approximating these 4 clusters with only 2 clusters, depending on the geometry of how you assign the labels, you're going to get your 2 cluster approximation is either going to be better or worse. Okay, so I'm running out of time. Let me conclude. So we have introduced here 2 models for structured data. We have provided some sharp asymptotic performance in the high dimensional limit for these 2 models. We have showed that it captures the learning curves on these structured data sets of some realistic data. And now you might ask me, okay, this is very interesting theoretical observation, but what can I do with that? So there are other papers by our group and colleagues that apply this for different things of interest in statistical learning theory, like deriving rates for kernel ridge regression, analyzing the lasso with a Gaussian mixture model when the features are weak and rare, and also with transfer learning. So if you're interested in that, come to the poster, either speak with me or with Cédric, and thank you for the attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bruno. Very interesting talk. I think that in the interest of time, we can only have like one short question. So if there's a question, maybe Adam wants to ask, or he'll email you the questions. He cannot speak now.
Or can come to the poster and we can ask the question in the poster.
Yeah. So I have one short question, which is in one of your plots, you had as the training error as the number of samples, and the error was increasing with the number of samples. So is that mean because the model is not expressive enough to fit all your data, or before that?
Was it before that?
Here, this one.
Here?
No.
So,
yeah, well, I think the one before that had it more. Yeah, that one. So for instance, here the blue one has or even the green one, they have the error is increasing with the number of samples. So
yeah, it starts with this double descent behavior, so that for a small number of samples compared to the number of parameters, you have this peak that happens exactly when you can exactly interpolate the data. But then we have these two regions where first the error decreases, then increases, and then decreases again. And that's just the usual double descent kind of story. It's just that here maybe it's more accentuated by the fact that as the features get better and better learned, gets more squeezed towards the small number of samples, because the rank of the matrix is getting the effective ground matrix of the learned features gets squeezed, gets smaller and smaller, so gets squeezed to the left.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, and let's thank all the speakers from the first session. Thank you, Caroline, Yannis, and Bruno, and we